Hey there, Puppy Turtle. I'd like to talk to you about two subjects in this video. The first I'm sure you're quite sick of, but I feel like it's important enough that it would be wrong of me not to voice my opinion. However, rather than try and give an exhaustive account of all of the arguments presented in your exchange with Soreta Yuki, I plan to instead focus on what I think is your main point. Now, the second subject cropped up in the comment section of one of Soreta's videos, and we discussed it rather briefly in a private exchange. That would be the issue of gay marriage. Now, I'm going to counter some arguments that I think you may make, rather than only the arguments that you have made. And I'm doing this because I've seen plenty of people make them before. So if something I say doesn't apply to you, don't sweat it. It's relevant to someone, and I may as well put this all in one video. So let's talk about abortion in the name of convenience. Unless I'm mistaken, you consider any abortion that is not performed because of medical necessity or to end a pregnancy that is a result of rape an abortion of convenience, or as you like to say, abortion as a form of birth control. And you support this notion by arguing that the right to life that the child has supersedes the rights of the mother, especially considering the fact that carrying a baby to term doesn't necessarily mean that the mother must also then raise the child. You mentioned the option of adoption quite often, and although you acknowledge that the foster system is rife with abuse and isn't a great place for a child, you say that it is not a fate worse than death. Now, there are two major problems with your line of reasoning. The first is an understandable but important oversight. As a 15-year-old boy, I doubt you've considered the consequences and potential complications of carrying a baby for 9 months, and the consequences and potential complications of giving birth. Even with the advances we've made in modern medicine, pregnancy is no cakewalk. And I don't mean that it's simply uncomfortable. In the United States, one of the most medically capable nations on the planet, nearly 17 live births out of every 100,000 result in the death of the mother. 20 times that number suffer injury, infection, or disease. And those numbers get much worse in less well-off nations, to the tune of 2,000 deaths for every 100,000 live births. The average medical costs of carrying a baby to term range in the thousands and are often out of reach of the same mothers who have been mentioned previously in this discussion for not having adequate means to raise a child on their own. And that's not counting the additional medical costs of dealing with the aforementioned complications. You're not just asking a woman to walk around with a baby in her stomach for a while. You're saying that a woman should be forced to risk her well-being and even her life against her will. The second problem with your thinking has to do with your idea of what constitutes a baby. Now, I'm sure that sounds a little odd to you, but you're going to have to be able to demonstrate that a small collection of cells, utterly devoid of even the possibility of consciousness, reasonably constitutes a life with all of the rights and privileges we afford a living human being. As far as I can tell, there's no reason to afford it this status. Now, there are two common arguments presented here that attempt to show why the destruction of these small groups of cells is an issue: human potential and the presence of a soul. There are a few problems with both. With today's science, almost every living cell in your body has the potential to become a fully functioning human, provided it's manipulated properly. If human potential were really your concern, you should be frightened for the fate of the millions of cells you shed every time you scratch an itch or take a shower. So, what exactly makes this particular group of cells qualitatively more special than those you care so little for? That question usually leads into the second argument, the presence of a soul. If you do believe that the soul enters the body at the moment of conception, what grounds do you have to make that assertion? And how do you deal with situations where young embryos split in two and develop into twins? Is that one soul splitting into two? What about situations where one twin absorbs another, forming a chimera? What happens to the extra soul? Does it go to heaven? Is it trapped in its sibling's body? Does God save it for another baby? This is clearly an area where you can't expect to make a ton of sense. More important here is the legal standpoint. Any person's belief that souls even exist, much less when they believe a soul becomes associated with a physical construct, is a private religious belief. As such, our secular nation can't make any laws based on that belief. This is precisely what the Establishment Clause demands. Even if your religious beliefs gave you a coherent model of the way souls work, which it can't, it would only grant you the ability to feel poorly about the decisions of other people to have abortions. It would not grant you the right to force those people to behave in a way that is congruent with your beliefs. These two realizations render your position wholly untenable. How could the rights, especially the right to life, of a fully functioning and fully established human being be superseded by the rights of an embryo, which has no more claim to life than the skin cells you wash down the drain? How could a woman be forced to spend thousands of dollars she may not even have and risk her life for the sake of something that can't even reasonably qualify as a child? Why do you care so little for the rights of those who are already living? Now, it seems to me that you have already conceded this point, because you admit that medically necessary abortions are acceptable. And I have to assume that this comes out of a respect for the right to life that the mother has. So, with the realization that every pregnancy presents a risk to the life of the mother, how do you reconcile that concession with your expressed position? And if abortion really is an issue for you, you should consider the following quote by Sam Harris. "The church's position on abortion takes no more notice of the details of biology than it does of the reality of human suffering. It has been estimated that 50% of all human conceptions end in spontaneous abortion, usually without a woman even realizing that she was pregnant. In fact, 20% of all recognized pregnancies end in miscarriage. There is an obvious truth here that cries out for acknowledgement. If God exists, he is the most prolific abortionist of all." Now, gay marriage. You claim to be opposed to letting homosexuals marry because you think it's a sin. What I tried to convey to you in our exchange, and what you seem to ignore, was that a ban on same-sex marriage enacted on the grounds that it was sinful would be unconstitutional because it would be a violation of the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. If you want it to be illegal for same-sex couples to marry, you have to demonstrate that there is a state interest in preventing such marriages. There is no state interest in promoting your religiously motivated idea of marriage. There is no state interest in defining marriages between one man and one woman. There is no state interest in protecting the original definition of marriage or preserving the institution of marriage. And any laws that do any of these things are unconstitutional because they violate the due process and equal protections clauses. And that's on top of the violation of the Establishment Clause for the reason you gave me. And the institution of marriage? In the 1600s version of the institution of marriage, a woman was not an equal partner, but a man's property. Oh, and this was only for white men and women. It wasn't until much later that we decided to change the institution of marriage and say that it was okay for African Americans to marry too, but only to each other. It wasn't until 1967 that we decided that interracial marriages were going to be an accepted part of the institution. No argument can be made against gay marriage that couldn't be made and wasn't made against all of these prior changes. And yet all of us would consider every single one of these changes to be a good thing, to be progress. And none of us would hesitate to call the people who opposed these changes misogynists, bigots, or worse. We live in the 21st century, in a country that is supposed to be the world's example of freedom, liberty, and justice. Our government was founded in opposition to oppression, and yet somehow, in the 236 years since this country was founded, we haven't managed to cease oppressing our own people. We have yet to provide basic rights to all of our citizens. I cannot abide anyone who supports oppression, and this foolishness cannot be branded by any other name. You have also argued that marriage laws defining marriage as between one man and one woman do, in fact, offer everyone equal protection because everyone is allowed to marry the same group of people. Straight men and gay men are both allowed to marry women, and vice versa. Not your brightest moment. There are two ways in which this violates the Equal Protections Clause, and they are pretty fucking obvious. Heterosexual people are allowed to marry the person that they love, the partner of their choice. Homosexual people are not afforded that right. Do you get that? But it doesn't stop there. Such a law would discriminate based on gender as well. A homosexual couple would be unable to marry simply because they had the misfortune of being born the same gender. Had either one of them been born differently, they'd be able to marry. Telling a man that he can't marry the consenting partner of his choice simply because he happens to be a man is no different from telling a woman that she can't vote simply because she happens to be a woman. Now, I know what you're thinking. We can offer same-sex couples civil unions. That way they get all the legal benefits of marriage without pissing off the people who'd rather not make that change. I thought this country had learned its lesson about that horrid idea of separate but equal. This does not solve any problems. It only allows those problems to live on under a different legal name. We desegregated for a reason. Why doesn't that reason apply here? Just imagine if we went back to our first conception of marriage and we told African Americans that they weren't allowed to marry. But don't worry, we can provide civil unions instead. I think that's about all I should say in this video. Puppy Turtle, when you wish to limit the rights of other people, when you want to affect the way people are allowed to behave, you need to consider the legality of what you want to do. And when the way in which you want to inhibit another person's actions, it ends up being unconstitutional, you need to ask yourself why. And right this minute, you need to ask yourself why your beliefs land you squarely in favor of oppression. I look forward to your response.